Toronto and other Canadian cities. I'm trying to think through what an undocumented movement doesn't accept Canadian sovereignty given its support of Indigenous decolonization, yet is fighting for status means, particularly given the position of the movement that Canada is largely constituted on stolen land. I've been involved for about 4 years now in known as Legal Toronto. I've had some time to reflect on its praxis and its political dynamic, which I see as being sometimes vague on its ambitions for very good reasons, which I hope to explore today with some help from Tony Negri's work on constituent power and Judith Butler's work on the politics of becoming a possible subject. So known as Legal fits into, for those of you who know the organization, fits into a broader anti-capitalist left in Toronto. Shares a lot of affinities with European and American no borders groups in terms of strategies, tactics, and aesthetic, but grew out of a particular web of contingencies in Toronto. Its most obvious movement influence was the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, a Toronto anti-poverty group whose direct action tactics fighting for the rights of homeless and poor people in Toronto included things such as physically interfering with airport deportations at Toronto's Pearson Airport and regular occupations of various ministerial offices as a show of force in the realization of various targeted goals. Precisely because known as Legal is a group whose broader network includes at different times many non-status people, there are good safety reasons why our own strategies and tactics don't tend towards those types of actions. More broadly, known as Legal grew out of a convergence of the anti-war and anti-globalization movements in Toronto, along with a group called the Status Coalition, which is made up of mainly immigrant advocacy groups advocating for something close to a sanctuary policy like those created in many American cities. The Status Coalition is often looked at now as a helpful precedent to the current movement, but is seen as having a tendency to validate liberal citizenship models as the ideal basis for immigrant incorporation, and often fell into the good immigrant, bad immigrant discourses, which were and are common in the Canadian media, and stand as a rhetorical base for Canada's Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. So the post-9/11 Canadian security state is the basis for the founding of known as Legal as it is today. In 2002, a new federal immigration act was passed, which granted, among other things, a lot more discretionary power to remove people to the Minister of Immigration, and began a process of restructuring the Canadian immigration system to our current state, in which an increasing number of migrants come as increasingly permanently temporary workers. Also, in Toronto in 2003, a multi-level security operation called Project Thread, in which a database search for migrants with Muslim names led to a massive Toronto area-wide roundup of hundreds of mostly Pakistani men on the grounds of terrorism charges, and when that came up well short of any evidence of any terrorist conspiracy, it ended up mutating into accusations of immigration fraud and led to 24 deportations. This radicalized segments of a largely services-oriented movement, and together with similar events that were happening in other cities, brought in many anarchist-inspired organizers into the fold. This led to the founding of known as Legal as an explicitly anti-capitalist organization that used a lot of existing contacts in Native communities in the region that were and still are fighting against the continued theft of their land, to develop a position that Canada is a settler state with a still unresolved foundational illegitimacy that gives it no right to deny migrants entry or status. In different capacities at different times, and with some shaky moments, around the terms of our community relationships, supporting different variations on Native decolonization through various types of requested support has been a pillar of our organizational framework from the beginning. While the specific forms of solidarity are contingent on relationships tying specific autonomous city-level movements to Native resistances scattered across the country, this has been important in the consolidation of energy to develop a firm status-for-all politics based on an expanding critique of the settler state and its own global impact in terms of its support for militarism and capitalist displacement. The form this ended up taking in terms of concrete strategy was the Don't Ask, Don't Tell campaign, which is a citywide but not necessarily municipally bounded campaign to have all possible services in the city delivered to anyone regardless of immigration status. So this is similar to sanctuary strategies that have been developed in American cities such as San Francisco, Houston, but it's not so much focused on having a blanket policy statement, even though we have gotten many blanket policy statements, as having service providers themselves develop a status-for-all internal politics. The best examples of this campaign's success would be the Toronto District School Board, which now has a Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and more importantly hangs posters and does training workshops on how to prevent enforcement from operating in schools. Also, the Toronto Police Services Board has passed a Don't Ask policy for anyone apprehended or reporting crimes, although that one's been a lot patchier in terms of its enforcement, and a citywide umbrella program called the Services Sanctuary Status Movement. Has thousands of participants in this program from a wide range of service providers whose funding largely comes from various levels of government. With varying levels of success, usually hinging on the effectiveness of on-site workers and their relationship to the broader anti-deportation movement in the city, Anti-violence against women's shelters and service centers have also been a key locus of developing capacity for undocumented residents. Other thrusts that have more recently started are the movement's Food for All, a food justice network based in Don't Ask, Don't Tell practices to get all possible social food provision services to serve the undocumented, and Health for All, a similar network of the city's health providers, aiming to ensure all health services offered in the city don't check for status. What's crucial in this widespread, more or less autonomously run set of groups and actors is that this program is founded explicitly in a direct questioning of Canadian citizenship itself. Indigenous political struggles figure heavily in all these spaces, or at least are part of the development of that status for all politics, and were part of the founding of the programs themselves in many cases. For the movement, this form of asking for social citizenship, while devalidating the Canadian state's citizenship form, brings up some identity problems around what it is we're asking for. Is status for all, which in its hallmarks, which you can check on our website, and I can share that with you later, includes a regularization program for all people without full immigration status, which is similar to much more numerically effective examples of such in various European countries. I think Spain recently regularized about 1 million people, which would very much suggest incorporation into the Canadian state as a goal. So I'm going to try and explore how that both is and is not the direction of this movement, nor is it inherently the subject position that founds the political operation of the actors in this movement, which are both people with and without full status. To help me think through this, I'm borrowing from Tony Negri's ideas around constituent power, which, when it's counterposed to constituted power, is the ontological immanent reality of living labor always exceeding, always desiring outside of, the forms that attempt to constitute it. This is an ontological condition of immanence, of labor always exceeding its own forms by the emergent communicative structures stemming from its own emergently produced material sets of conditions. This is really important for his reading of biopower, which for Negri operates at those two poles. The biopower of constituted power, or biopotere, which follows Foucault and his development of the concept, and that's attempting to discipline subjects into legibility so they can be intervened on, controlled, and ultimately produced, where sovereignty has been decoupled from single centers and invests itself in the very production of life, and following Agamben, the limits to life. While the biopower of constituent power, I'm speaking way too fast here. While the biopower of constituent power, or biopotenza, is one that is the always emergent singularity of living labor constantly developing and producing new forms of possible life, close to, but for example, it materially exceeds the immanence that was discussed in Renaissance humanism, in its claim on the idea of man being situated in its absolute social production, as producing its own temporality, rather than always negating a transcendent and alienated form of representative power. As Negri puts it, constituent power is the strength of producing constitutive trajectories. It is time that is in no way predetermined, and it is thus a singular constitution. It identifies itself as ontological strength, constituent power capable of producing absolute events. The political here is production par excellence, collective and non-teleological. Innovation constitutes the political. Constitution cannot but be constant innovation. In this sense, there is no ideal end state which is reached with any finality in revolutions claiming the free subject. Only the imminent production of new forms of life, new capacities for being in common, some of which are captured by capital and its state through legal norms, disciplinary mechanisms, and more diffuse normative powers, even though normalizing power, the care of the self, of course, occurs well beyond the state. Indeed, this exploitation of the constant production of the common is precisely how capital supersedes its own contradictions in Negri's reading. Even in attaching itself to emergent forms of being and disciplining that emergence into managerial, operationalized sets of juridical categories and biopolitical regimes, there is always an ontological gap between constituted power and the living labor of constituent power exceeding the forms which claim to represent and invest in them. In Negri's reading of biopower, which moves in quite distinct directions from Foucault's development of the concept, there are two totalities simultaneously operating between potere, or power, and potenza, or strength, the former living off but not being dialectically bound to the latter. So Angela Mitropoulos, an autonomist Greek scholar, talks about this living labor, this biopotenza, with specific regards to migrants, which she proposes as part of a strategic capacity of migrants, who aren't just victims of displacement, but are actively seeking and producing their own conditions as well, to decompose and recompose themselves in movement and in their own spaces. Their movements, both literally and in the sense of social subjectivity in politics, are part of the new biopolitical apparatuses of capture of modern states, even though they are constitutively always exceeding the forms attempted by those states. In this sense is a demand for legally equal access to dignified conditions of material life in a place, so documentation, an insertion into precisely the capitalist state's biopotere, its grip on production and reproduction. This really focuses on the problematic of recognition, which for groups like Known as Legal is one that we've been at various times haunted by. Are we validating the Canadian state and its biopolitical regimes of migrant control when we demand status for all? Or can we look at this in a way that gives a certain strategic agency to this demand, a certain creative excess outside of capture in using it, a certain cynicism around the tensions of state recognition, lest we be subsumed further into the society of control? And I want to include Judith Butler's comments on recognition here before proceeding, given that her work on the tensions between becoming and being are still tied to the Hegelian idea of dialectics, which Negri wants to discard. Butler points out that it's not just the self looking for the other to recognize it, but the self is looking for its own reflection in the other. So there's a third space created in this process of seeking recognition, when you're desiring the other's desire, where there is an inherently unstable subjectivity, something outside of normalizing power that normalizing power then acts on. When the other is taken to be the state, which Butler looks at when she's discussing how gay marriage disciplines possible kinship arrangements into heteronormative binaries, Butler would say that you're desiring the state's desire, which is a fantasy of unity and interchangeable recognition. So when you're being recognized by the state in modern citizenship regimes, you're losing part of your possible self to the normalizing power that the state operates as. She's quick to point out, though, that the state isn't this idealized, unified whole, and can be exploited productively by using some of its parts against the others. Even though the fantasy of the state is unity, there's actually a lot of fragmentation that operates relatively functionally despite active contradiction. I want to focus on that possibility, which we do all the time in Known as Legal, in getting service providers to become part of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the Status for All campaign and actively fight enforcement. We're operating here in a politics of possible subjects, given that we don't valorize Canadian citizenship in nonetheless struggling for its formal and biopolitical benefits. We're desiring the state's desire, but we're also changing the desire of, for example, the state personnel who are carrying out our programs, like teachers in the TDSB who actively challenge enforcement, federally funded rape crisis center workers who chase Canadian Border Services agents from their premises. And more importantly, we're desiring that state desire with explicitly instrumental value placed on that status. So Peter Niersch from McMaster and Hamilton and Poli-Sci, he's also worked directly with Known as Legal, and he suggested that non-citizens here are committing acts of citizenship, beyond and despite formal citizenship status, which allow for them to become recognized as social citizens without going through the usual mechanisms of state recognition. I only partially agree with this. I'd say rather that through this Known as Legal variety of citizen politics, we're wearing the costume of formal citizenship to lock down biopolitical advantage by making non-status lives more possible in the city. But we're also always exceeding the citizen form of politics in that we're demanding an impossible subject beyond Canadian citizenship, where there isn't really a territory to inhabit yet, while simultaneously making that status part of our strategy. So we're producing a certain city in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell sites that are expanding regularly in different contextual forms, even though we're not validating that city as part of some final realized citizen identity. This is what I'm labeling cynical citizenship. We acknowledge the real obvious benefits of regularization, but do not, as our basis for subjectivity, accept the Canadian state as the recognizing form. Following Negri and his version of constituent power, this is an ontological outside to the citizen form. This also helps explain why some of our most productive developments in our networks of allies have been with anti-ableist organizations and queer and transaction organizations, who are always operating on that boundary line between the radical politics of a possible subject and the benefits of recognition by and within constituted power. Now, it's not as if Known as Legal gets to define the terms of native decolonization, but in specific cities, this has been premised on directly addressing, through solidarity, what for some might seem like an inherent and immutable contradiction. Indigenous land rights and anti-colonial nationhood against claims to develop capacity for what could be conceived as an ever-increasing number of settlers on disputed territory. I think it's telling to look at the conversation between Benita Lawrence and Inakshi Dua and their position on Indigenous nationhood needing to be forefronted in anti-racist and anti-colonial struggle in Canada, and Nandita Sharma and Cynthia Wright's responses to this position, from what they describe as a no-borders standpoint. Lawrence and Dua point out that the discussion about native land rights is not a rhetorical position. in Native national life, connections to specific territories are a basis of language and survival for many Native communities, which have been destroyed numerically and culturally over the years. This land issue is marginal in their reading in most anti-racist practice in Canada, even though it's often at the core of insurgent Native community struggles. This oversight often puts indigeneity into the blender of simultaneous anti-colonial positions among exploited diasporic and racialized groups, particularly in the city. As such, anti-racist work developing an anti-colonial standpoint in a settler state requires a decoupling of Native struggles from a pluralistic framework, and more close attention to the land-based reality of community reclamation that is ongoing, including between reserves and those Native people that have been legislated out of Indian status. In particular, urban Natives lacking status are in a process of forming a subject position that can address the way legislation such as the Indian Act and state programs such as residential schools and the foster care system have acted as genocidal programs that have separated Native peoples from their traditional communities. This cannot emerge as a decolonization process with specific relation to specific territories if Natives lacking Indian status are projected as one among many equal anti-colonial positions in challenging the colonial state. As they put it, people of color are settlers, even those without documentation, and those willing to challenge the colonial situation in Canada need to wrestle with that tension as they mount various challenges to the modern settler state. As they put it, borders in the Americas are European fictions, restricting Native peoples' passage and that of peoples of color. However, to speak of opening borders without addressing Native land loss and ongoing struggles to reclaim territories is to divide communities that are already marginalized from one another. The question that must be asked is how opening borders would affect Native struggles aimed at reclaiming land and nationhood. So that last word, nationhood, is precisely the grounds on which Sharma and Wright, who are writing from an open borders perspective, refuse any static definition of the colonizer and the colonized in the colonial settler state. Displacement and relocation are historically violent processes, according to Sharma and Wright, of dispossession that make migration a repetitive and necessary event, including, of course, in a global sense, Native people, Indigenous people. While acknowledging that a civil rights method in anti-racist work doesn't address colonialism, and real decolonization needs to address Native title, they ask quite succinctly, to not colonize, do you have to stay put? Further, they question the ways in which Native nationalism has been developed as a mimetic version to nation-state thinking, what with the centrality of land claims to Native struggle. They point out, and I don't think Lawrence here would disagree, the way that racially coded varieties of nationhood define nativeness in different contexts, which often ignores the way miscegenation and Native settler alliances have been crucial survival strategies, often directly against settler colonial state advancement, that have produced fragmented, hybridized, and contradictory versions of indigeneity across the Americas. In their reading, what a decolonization movement in the settler colonial situation should mean is an attempt to recover the commons, which is more a practice than a territorial form requiring a transcendent state power to organize it. Demanding access to the full production of life without begging for recognition by the settler state is precisely a means of producing the common that undocumented people, this is again Sharman Wright speaking, in such movements as Status for All are enacting. Colonization is the theft of the commons, and the agents of decolonization are the commoners, which following Negri requires an immediate set of social relations not alienated to a constituted power. I think Frantz Fanon's views on settlers here in the decolonization process can be telling, even if his experiences in an armed struggle against metropolitan colonization are definitively not directly translatable to the contemporary Canadian settler colonial situation. In discussing national consciousness in the destruction of colonialism, Fanon is emphatic that an anti-colonial national consciousness is precisely the opposite of bourgeois nationalist mystification. It is the production of relays between vastly different subject positions premised on the attack on the dehumanizing social relations of colonialism. In the emergence of anti-colonial national consciousness, there is an immediacy, as he puts it, a taste for the tangible, which makes indigenous traditions come to bear on the immediate horizon of producing a very real but new form of humanity in the struggle against the colonial state. Indigeneity and decolonization is unmoored from its frozen colonial tropes, and for him he's specifically talking about negritude and black nationalism as kind of frozen because of the colonial relation into a very mystified form of being. So it's unmoored from its frozen colonial tropes, and it becomes a relational process of reinscribing traditional forms on a radically emergent event. Settlers, in the confusing and contradictory melee of a decolonization struggle, were in Fanon's readings forced to reinvent themselves as subjects, many choosing semi-fascist positions of enforcing colonial rule on racially barbarized others, many carrying out anti-colonial war and reconstituting their political being in the process. Fanon, though not a settler, he was still a migrant in that case, saw himself as taking full part in the production of the Algerian nation as a renewed horizon for the human. How am I doing on time?
Close to half an hour.
Oh, okay, I got 2 more pages left.
It's not late.
Oh,
Yeah, it's just 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll finish that. I just got 2 pages left. Taiyake Alfred's views on native sovereignty are also important here. Alfred, while maintaining a very place-based construction of the boundaries of native, which Lawrence has some problems with, particularly given that a lot of her work focuses on people who have been forced out of status and therefore have been separated from indigenous communities. For example, people without treaty, such as Métis or Algonquins, for example, in northeastern Ontario. And a lot of people have been cut out of the Indian Act, for example, by the gendered nature of how marriage passed on status. Yeah, she has some problems with it anyway, that there's a specific idea of a real Indian community. But she points out that Alfred points out that territorial grants do not define substantial sovereignty. Rather, traditional forms of governance and being, which have survived in various forms in native communities across Turtle Island, need to be reapplied contextually to the realities of everyday existence. For Alfred, there is a universal rationality embedded in native traditions that animates a new potentiality for the human. Any vestiges of being wards of the state need to be abandoned, in that any lasting premise of a native episteme, guiding a substantial decolonization process, needs to assert itself into precisely the tensions that cannot be resolved when nativeness is a romanticized folkloric entity surviving under domination. One of these key tensions in the relationship of decolonization to a numerically overwhelming and internally fragmented settler population, in that Alfred rejects the idea of a native revolution throwing out the settlers. This is not only impossible in his estimation, but goes against almost all native understandings of power as a socio-natural balance, requiring face-to-face relations. And therefore, relationships between settler communities have always been premised in things such as the two-row wampum as a basis for mutual interaction on a recognition of autonomy. In this sense, nationhood is not territorial sovereignty, but rather self-determination. Framing sovereignty as based in Western territorial governance structures and alienated constitutionality is only possible if native leaders remain colonized. Asserting native rights, quote-unquote, is only a decolonization process if it is unhinged from a concept of a state granting them. This seems contradictory in the sense of the vast range of kind of fiduciary obligations to native communities by the Canadian government, that being central to the often meager social reproduction of these dying communities. But Alfred frames this in ways that weave quite closely to the instrumental cynicism of undocumented people demanding state benefits as common rights, despite their lack of recognition in any social contract model of sovereignty, precisely by building anti-colonial solidarity in the sites in which those common rights are realized. While the building of economic self-sufficiency is often lacking for native communities outside of further capitalist exploitation of their lands, the basis for survival and decolonization requires sustained relationships with settlers, willing to actively undermine settler states' sovereignty and practice native self-determination. This is not based on the becoming indigenous of the settler, but rather opens a relay for the common attack on the colonial state. The subject of this struggle is indeterminate, precisely because it requires a shattering of colonial social relations. So, as far as known as illegal's role goes, this is in a sense a war of position, in that we are attempting to make common sense the notion that no one is illegal in a colonial settler state. And we've seen some major developments in our wider affinity webs that we have in Toronto. But the subject occupying that position is inherently, to use Mitropoulos' words, indeterminate but not haphazard. Decolonization is an unlearning process, based on the creation of immediate relationships based on a respect for the self-determination of those most under attack by the settler state, and building modes of existing in the world that don't rely on state validation and bureaucratization, nor on what Verasini would propose is the always existing ideological condition of the settler state, that is, the desire for the indigenous to find closure in their absorption into the settler body. When read through Negri's understanding of biopotenza, which is precisely not the negation of difference through synthesis, but the creation of a plane of singularity on which an emergent common subject can be built.